Okay, so hello everyone. Good afternoon. I'm here to talk to you all about the Code of Conduct, more specifically the LGNZ Model Code of Conduct. So around a year or so ago, there was a workshop that we were all involved in. Some of you were involved in. That brought up this idea of the LGNZ Model Code of Conduct, and there was some interest that was given in some of the processes that are involved in the model code. So I'm just here today to talk to you about the Model Code of Conduct, maybe as it compares to the current Code of Conduct, and just to gauge that interest on some of the more specifics. So there is a statutory obligation to adopt a Code of Conduct, as I'm sure you'll be aware of. And just to be clear from the outset, that the current Code of Conduct, it does adhere to the statutory obligations that you have. So we're just looking at this as potentially a process improvement. So broadly, Code of Conduct is all about openness and transparency in local government, so that there's avenues for complaints to be made where people think there are breaches and a means to resolve those. Just to be completely clear, nothing in your Code of Conduct prevents you from expressing personal views. There are some caveats to that around the expression of personal views. We can talk a little bit about that later if you like to. So
the statutory duty to adopt the Code of Conduct only applies to councillors, even though there may be other elected officials.
So you're referring to community boards?
Yes.
So there's no statutory obligation for community boards to adopt a Code of Conduct. But as you'll see on, I think it's sort of the second page of the current Code of Conduct, all but one have chosen to adopt the Code of Conduct.
Well, I'm just checking that hasn't changed. So the statute's in the found where?
So it just omits any reference to the community board. So it is in the LGA, Clause 15, Schedule 7. So you can refer to that if you'd like to.
I think that was challenged in 2015 or something, somewhere.
To whom that applies?
Yeah, there was a test, a community board test. There is. I'll send it through to you when I actually remember when it was. But yeah, there was a challenge because I did some research on it just to kind of see, and it ended up in court somewhere at some stage. And it was ruled that they didn't have to have a Code of Conduct.
Okay, so this is just a refresher broadly. There's lots of different statutes that apply to the ethical behaviour of elected members. You'll see in our current Code of Conduct and also within the Model Code of Conduct that all of these obligations under each of these pieces of legislation, there's more specifics and things that are outlined for you. Okay, so the Model Code of Conduct released by LGNZ, it provides a template with various options available to you if you're interested. So there is a process for ensuring the independence for dealing with breaches and for handling the recommendations that come out of those breaches. There's a draft policy that essentially outlines all of that stuff. And there's a couple of options there with that sort of policy for dealing with these breaches. It can be embedded within the code as it currently is in the Southland District Council Code of Conduct, or it can be as a separate policy. So there are some strengths and weaknesses of the two. So having it embedded within your Code of Conduct, it means that the council does require a supermajority or 75% in order to make changes to that process. If it's under a separate policy, then those changes can be made with the normal requirements. So it also contains an overview of the legislation as is in the current conduct. Yeah, so these are some of the updates. Explicit description, that's nothing different than is in the current code of conduct, although in the current code of conduct they're not necessarily given examples and things like that. Under the model code there are some given. In the model code of conduct there's an acknowledgement of the Treaty of Waitangi and description of principles and how they may apply. Good governance principles, it's also contained in the current code of conduct. There is the approach that's outlined, as I mentioned before, and specifically within that process, it's designed so that minor or trivial complaints can be dealt with earlier than the current code of conduct sort of allows for.
What would be the definition of a minor or trivial complaint?
So that would be something that fails to meet the material or significance tests highlighted under the model code. So there's a series of questions. We are getting to that slide, but there's a series of questions that essentially an independent investigator would ask about the situation, and those things relate to the impact, whether or not it seems to have been made purposefully or it was by accident. It would be looking at whether or not it was a single occurrence or there's a pattern that can be established there. And so because the situations can be quite varied, then those questions or the findings of that would have different weights in different circumstances. So just some of the unacceptable sort of behaviours and things that are outlined. These are no different than as in the current Southland District Council Code of Conduct. A refresher on the principles of good governance. Okay, so these are the processes. So under the LGNZ Model Code of Conduct, they have outlined this stuff within a policy template that they've proposed. And as I say, that process can either be embedded within the Code of Conduct or it can be a separate policy. So two processes essentially that they propose. So the single step process would be that the Chief Executive receives the complaints regarding an elected member and an alleged breach of the Code of Conduct, and then the Chief Executive would refer all of these complaints to the independent investigator for assessment of the complaint. So the independent investigator will take into account the things that I've just mentioned in terms of whether they would determine that to be a significant breach or a minor or trivial, and then would make recommendations on how that may be dealt with by council. So that could be mediation, that could be by apology, that could be various other things. So the difference with that and the two-step process, so the two-step process is the main recommendation by LGNZ. If you'd like to have a look at these are also outlined on page 16 to 21 of the Model Code of Conduct. So under the two-step process, there is two people involved, essentially, that are independent of the process. So the Chief Executive refers the complaints to an initial assessor, and then that initial assessor, they have a look at the situation. They will come up with their own findings and things on whether this is, the significance of this complaint, and then following that, they would refer that to an independent investigator, or they would refer it back to the Chief Executive for mediation for one of the smaller type outcomes if the test of significance is not met. The independent investigator would then take it from that point, and then they would conduct another assessment, so it would have to pass the two checks of whether or not they consider it to be significant, and then that's when they would begin an investigation if the level of significance is met. So this is an outline really of the role of the independent investigator. So they would determine whether the breach has occurred, determine the seriousness of the breach, and then make a recommendation report on actions that they believe council should make in response to the breach. So these are just the assessment of significance are just the things that I have been talking about. Intentional, unintentional, first time or a pattern established, whether there are legal or financial ramifications to the breach, and the impact on the council and general public. So there are processes outlined within the model code of how you would select your initial assessor and or your independent investigator. So one of the main points that the model code tries to highlight is that these individuals would be politically independent. So they would be removed from any of the elected members. But also, in terms of the two-step process where it involves an initial assessor, that person is easily accessible, so that if complaints are made, that they can be dealt with in a timely manner, not dragged out unnecessarily. The independent investigator, there is a list of suggestions that LGNZ makes. I believe that's on page 21. If you refer to your So what it suggests essentially is that it would be a person of standing within the community. So that could be a former chief executive, that could be somebody who had worked, is now retired and works in law enforcement, whether that be a national agency who deals with these types of complaints and things. The choice would be up to the chief executive and council to decide who those people would be. Another choice to be made if a given council proceeds with adopting the model code is whether the recommendations would be binding or non-binding. So LGNZ does suggest that the results or the recommendations given in these reports to councils, that they agree that their results will be binding. And that is just another step within the process of ensuring that the process is politically independent. That it's an objective process that can be trusted. But there are other possibilities within there. So even if council wouldn't like them to be binding recommendations, then there can be an assessment done by an independent committee. So there's lots of possibilities available, and it would depend on what a council would be comfortable with. Okay, so now I'd just like to get a little bit of feedback and things from everyone. So from your own sort of reading and our very brief discussion around this, is there still broad interest within the model code and the processes that have been outlined in it?
I think thankfully we haven't had to use it, so which is good. But one of the concerns I've got around some of the approaches that were discussed here, based on our neighbouring council, last triennium, is there'd be a $10,000 budget allocated to an internal investigation done where the outcome is an apology. And that's not good use of ratepayers' money for a process that goes through this huge big thing, and then someone says, "Oh, I'm sorry," and it costs the ratepayer $10,000. So I think some of this independent kind of approach for minimal things with minimal consequences, I think we've got to weigh up the value of what the cost of the process actually is for what the outcome actually
gets us.
Yeah, that's understandable.
Huge. To it.
It's hard because we haven't really had to test it ourselves to see, but I guess it's also an important document to have, and have a strong one for if you do need it, you want it to actually be fit for purpose.
If
I could ask, what is the biggest difference between the one we have currently and the LGNZ one that they are suggesting? What would you say are the key differences?
I would say, so the biggest difference would be that in the current code, so the chief executive or mayor would receive a complaint about, an elected member and an alleged breach of the code of conduct. And then where that would go is to the executive committee.
Right.
So the Southland District Executive Committee, and then it would be up to them to make a report, based on the complaint and the significance and things like that, and then they would make a recommendation to council, and then council would have the decision on whether they,
Proceed or not.
So the major difference I would say between it is that it removes elected officials from making decisions about other elected officials, and it's really just to reaffirm the independence and objectivity of the process.
Just to add to that, one advantage that we've got in the executive committee is we've got an independently appointed chair, and so we've got that external, in our current setup, we have that external objective person in the mix that could potentially be a default for us to kind of adapt.
Yeah.
So within the recommendations, that's absolutely true. Within the recommendations themselves, there is that level of objectivity.
How does it matter whether we embed the policy or keep it separate?
The difference between embedding and having it separate. So really what that comes down to is the ability to make changes on it. So So it's the consensus that would be achieved and the ability to make changes, because a code of conduct can only be changed by a supermajority.
Yep, thank you.
Are there any other questions or feedback? Or
So also just the purpose of this workshop is really that there was some interest shown sort of a year or so ago. We're just seeing whether there would still be that sort of interest and whether we would go down, or maybe is there any aspects of the model code which you like, would prefer over the current code, or are you quite happy with how things are?
the biggest change that you've talked about is that independent versus internal versus external.
Yeah.
I was just going to ask about if it's a policy, a separate policy, it's then subject to consultation in a wider sense, not just internally.
So it would go through the policy process and things. I couldn't say for certain at this stage, like what level of consultation and things that the policy would go through. So there is that ability to do that, but if there was going to be a separate policy, then that would also require an amendment to be made to the current policy, because the current policy does outline a process. So did that answer the question?
Thank you.
Any other?
Any questions about any specifics of the?
Process, because this is nearly all boards have adopted this as well, so it applies as far as this process goes, and it needs to be discussed with the community board as well as this. I'm not sure how.
So,
and there's obviously a report tabled with the council to the.
okay. So that would be potentially one of the weaknesses of the council itself adopting the model code, is that there would be no requirement on community boards to make the change to adopt the new code, and you could end up in a situation where council has a different code of conduct than the ones that the community board have adopted. Sorry, what was it?
We kind of have that now. We have one board that doesn't have a code of conduct.
This is hypothetically speaking, but you pointed out that one board does not have a code of conduct. What happens? Does that mean if there is something that's viewed as a trespass, they get off scot-free? Is that what it amounts to?
Trespass.
I mean, if they do something which, if they did have a code, was subject to the code of conduct. If they don't have, they are not liable.
So there's no process for dealing with it. In terms of liability, so they still must adhere to the other statutory requirements of them. So there's all of the legislation that we outlined in the beginning around ethical behaviour and things. They are absolutely still subject to all of those pieces of legislation.
So it just comes down to like voter choice at a subsequent election, accountability by the ratepayers through election.
Okay. Good. Yeah.
So just, I guess, a question back to staff. Like, do you see any major red flags or issues with the, like, if we just leave as it is with the current code of conduct? Is there anything that stands out that, having had a look at the LGNZ one, that you think needs to be changed from your opinion?
Would you like to offer an opinion? Yeah, maybe.
Well, we are aware that there's not the ability to, if there is a frivolous or a very minor allegation made, that through the process in the model code, there's sort of a more of an ability to identify it at an early stage, whereas in the current code you have to progress through to the executive committee and do the process. There isn't the same ability as there to deal with those minor matters.
There isn't necessarily a cost other than time to that process doing it internally, whereas one would still be externally, so that even a frivolous one would still encounter a cost.
Raise the independence is the other. Is there anything else you would add?
No, I wouldn't say. So yeah, that is just sort of the main thing that had been discussed, and that was around the dealing with minor and frivolous, complaints and things. But as you say, there is, a time cost, whereas there would be a financial cost involved with the dealing with the other one. But yeah, it would be that there's no difference on how the process is in the current code of how any sort of allegation may be dealt with.
So I guess the conflict would be if there was a complaint against a member of the executive committee, how we would handle that. But I think having Bruce's independence there, like that member could remove themselves from the process and there still be enough in there with the chief executive and the independent chair and the other member of the committee to...
Still the option of using an independent in that circumstance.
They have that option available to use the
chair, the
investigator or otherwise.
So when Macau and I checked in with you last year, there was an appetite to progress it, and so we just wanted, Jason, today was trying to get a bit more detail about the stance you wanted to take if we do put this up to you as a report. So I guess it's important to check in about whether you still want us to do this before the next election. I mean, it could be done, you adopted your code of conduct last time just after the inaugural meeting, after elections. We could aim to do it then, or we could still try and do it now. So I'm interested in the appetite.
Do you have any strong views? Almost feels like if I'm reading it right, due to the lack of thing, that it's not broken, so don't fix it.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
To me, the new model LGNZ looks great just as its own document, and without doing the direct A/B comparison. I remember just from memory of reading the original code of conduct. This one just seems a lot more kind of modern and relative now. But whether it's so important that we make our community boards consider this right now, they might have other things that they just want to get on with in the community boards rather than that election admin of adopting standing orders and code of conduct. My thought is transition into this, but if transitioning into it means having to deal with it and have all the discussions with the community boards now, I think, I can't speak for them, but it seems like it would just kind of just happen, and it's one of those issues that isn't really an issue either, but it could be an issue if an issue comes up. So it's like being prepared for it with the right way forward, but also not making a big issue around something that no one currently...
Just nervous of the work and the flow up to the boards and the...
Yeah, I guess just that sentiment in some of the community boards of why are we doing this shit again? We want to talk about this issue in town or something.
Perhaps aiming for after elections so that it's presented as a draft for discussion maybe and then to be adopted.
Because on the whole, I mean, we're not having any issues across the boards other than the one that hasn't signed the code of conduct, which is the only one that you'd be kind of looking at around this. So on the whole, we're not actually, yes, I think, yeah.
One issue that I do kind of, in my mind, wonder is when you read the new document and one of the examples around like release of or disclosing confidential information, that makes sense as a code of conduct, as you don't do that. But from a process point of view, as an elected member, it's sometimes very confusing when something is confidential. You might have a meeting and publicly excluded to, under the Privacy Act, not breach that and accidentally name and shame someone in a streamed meeting. But once that meeting's and discussion's been done, the subject of the report, I'm sometimes left there going, am I allowed to discuss this with the community board or members of the community who might have interest in that? And code of conduct aside, I think operationally some better clarity around confidential information and when reports are now public and those things. Otherwise, to not breach the old or potential new code of conduct is sometimes someone new to this, like, right, and having it just go, oh, I want to talk to you about, oh no, I'm not sure if I can talk to you about that. Oh, wait, let me check if I can talk to you about this thing that I think you should know about, but I'm not allowed to talk to you.
That's a very valid point, but that's more of a process thing, because I'm just thinking in terms of if you did accidentally do that and we instigated the code of conduct on it, it'd kind of almost be insane, because you've accidentally done something and then we're going to go, right, you've breached the code of conduct, let's get an independent investigator and spend some money, and then, oh Matt, you have to say sorry for breaching the code of conduct. But yeah, it's a valid point around that, and I think it's something we do need to work on with the public excluded items as to when they can be released and how, and actually get that almost built into the motions if we can.
So we're actually, I think you might have seen it in some of our activity management plans, looking at having a KPI on when looking at all public excluded material, having a resolution about when or if it can be released at a later date. So that's something we're working.
So you mean when it comes, it'll have that?
It's part of the resolution, yes.
That would be great. There's stuff from last year that I'm still not sure whether I can talk about.
Yeah, and I can definitely feed that back to staff too, that they're just wanting, you guys are wanting more clarity on that confidential nature of material and when you can discuss it. So, thank you. Right. So after elections, for the code of conduct.
That there is a choice about the process to follow for in relation to any alleged breaches, allows that to be dealt with.
So yeah, just not that we're going into this too much, but just under the processes, there is a difference between the independent investigator that was outlined and the initial assessor. So the initial assessor process was very much so that those minor or frivolous could be sort of dealt with very, very quickly. And the reason why that's not as much as an in-depth process is because it's, has that 2 steps, and then that is what can trigger the investigation.
Also, as to the expense of the whole process, you've got 2 people involved, and I think we haven't got experience to kind of say whether this is going to be an issue or not.
So yeah, it would be something to note if there had been feedback around, or a complaint that was made around the lack of political objectivity in the process and things. So yeah, that's understandable. All right, well, thank you very much. Thank you for your feedback and discussion.
We have our voting bylaw. The bylaw, sorry.
Now, I've just printed. I have printed off a few copies just because it's refer to them through the presentation, and there have been a couple of tweaks since I originally put it up on the hub. Well, thank you, everybody. Today's workshop is for the purpose of talking about the speed management plan. Councillors will remember prior to Christmas, we put up a report which summarised the submissions that were received, presented all the submissions and summarised them at a high level. Today we return to you for a workshop to cover off, I think, some of the challenges which have been thrown up in recent months as a result of political change, and likewise, if possible, just cover some of the other challenges which have been thrown up with the speed management plan that have arisen from consultation. So my intent is not to go through every single word in this presentation in detail. There is a lot of information in it. It is more there for reference if we need to look at it. It will help inform gaining feedback. So, of course, as a workshop, this isn't for the purpose of making a decision, but to get a steer from councillors around how they would like us to approach some of these challenges for when we come up with a final draft of the speed management plan for deliberation and adoption. That is if we do come back for deliberation and adoption. So this slide just kind of basically covers off more or less what I've said before. So we'll cover off firstly the government changes, then briefly cover the consultation feedback, splitting between what has challenges, but also lightly touching on those things which we think don't present an issue under the speed management plan and won't need to be covered in further detail today. And then, if necessary, we can then dive into some of the details of some of the proposals with challenges, which essentially circle around permanent speed limit proposals for schools, some of the other roads in the district where speed limit changes have been proposed, our boundary roads with ICC, and then also the compulsory review of 70 km/h speed limit zones. So any questions before I jump in to the next slide? Cool.
Well, just the one. So you mentioned the 730k of Wakatai funding's forfeited if we don't proceed. So that's
So
the government cut back on that.
So it's not a cutback; it's more of a timing issue. So we have approximately 1.4 million in our current budget to spend towards these initiatives primarily around schools, and that is to be spent by 30th of June this year. So, and of course, there's a proportion of that is funded by Wakatai. So, to the extent we aren't able to achieve that by June this year, those funds would be forfeited, and I presume we would have to go through an approach to reapply for it.
That's correct. Yeah, it's just there's unfortunate things, I suppose, in terms of the pros is we get a 3-year budget, so we know what the next 3 years looks like. The disadvantage is that at the end of 3 years, it's if you haven't spent it, then the clock resets. So we're in year 3, so 30th of June. If we haven't used it, effectively you lose it, and then we'd have to reapply for that funding.
So is there a possibility, if we agree to what we've already indicated, that that work will be done by that time?
So we've taken steps to do our best to be able to deliver. That's the direction we're still going to proceed. Things that require a bit of leading time, like procuring of the signs, there's a bit of leading time required to that. So we've already started that process to try and mitigate some of those risks. So we do have a good chance that if we get the green light, then
Given the government comments around the speed, it's unlikely that this priority will be in the new government policy statement.
correct.
So we've got this year to do it, or not at all, and we're confident that that funding won't be withdrawn prior to the end of June.
That's correct, because the funding's been committed or assigned to STC and other, like any other council that's been successful in obtaining that funding.
So just to recap the government changes that occurred or that were announced late last year, which basically coincided with us reporting back the consultation findings. So essentially, in December last year, the new government announced that for speed management plans, the certification deadline of 29 March is removed. So that provides some flexibility to councils in terms of the timing that those plans are implemented, or not implemented, adopted and approved. And likewise, the deadlines around schools were removed as well. So that was to have 40% of schools transitioned by 30th of June next year, and then to have 100% of schools transitioned by 31 December 2027. Those requirements, however, don't remove the obligation to review speeds around schools or categorise schools accordingly when we review those speeds. It simply has removed the deadline to have completed that process. Likewise, government has signalled that the setting of speed limits rule, which is essentially the overarching piece of legislation that dictates our approach to speed management, is looking to be replaced in 2024. They haven't set a great deal of detail at this point of what that would look like, other than given some indicative policy approaches in relation to it, which is a preference for variable speed limits around schools and for blanket speed limit changes, for there to be a higher consideration in relation to economic factors in the decision to lower speed limit. Likewise, they have also signalled that the road to zero strategy of the previous government is no longer the government's road safety strategy, and they'll plan to release their own this year as well. So in the context of that, that does raise some questions about how we approach our speed management plan. The timing, I guess, in terms of our decision process was not brilliant. So I have just put together some high-level advantages and disadvantages if we chose to stop, because I know that was a question that was raised previously. Could we stop if we had to? So this is attempting to give a bit of context to a decision around stopping. Essentially, if we did choose to stop now, school speed limit reductions would be able to be properly aligned to the new rule once it's implemented, as we don't have clarity on that at this point. And likewise, the speed limit changes are implemented just the once within the 3-year speed management planning period. So there is some risk if we proceeded with the speed management plan now that we may have to make some amendments to those speeds around schools, either at the next speed management plan or before. But there's no detail on what that means. The disadvantage of stopping at this point, obviously there is a delay in the safety improvements as proposed in the current speed management plan. The community support received for the proposals in the speed management plan is not acted upon, and consultation may be required again. There would also be some additional costs of reviewing and consulting on the speed management plan again within the next 12 to 18 months. We mentioned it before, the Waka Kotahi funding would be forfeited under this period and would need to be reapplied for again, and there's potential for costs of implementation to increase. Sorry?
Do we know what the possibility is of Waka Kotahi, for example, on the main roads and through the state highway, of not reducing the speed outside the school, and that we have reduced the speeds all around the back roads?
They are still proceeding with predominantly with variable speeds. They're sticking to those, and I've already started having some questions coming through from them. So they've already gone out for tender for their work. I don't know if the contractor's been told go and do it yet, but they are very close. If we were to proceed, we would be very close to aligning time-wise with them.
So they're going to tender just for the school work, or they're going to tender for all the work?
They tendered nationally for all of it.
Some of it's obviously going to get wound back with the highway ones that they're doing, so.
Oh, sorry, it's just the school
School.
stuff.
Yeah, they've, to the best of knowledge, they're stuck with the schools and still following that.
How long the views that we have, the consultation we've done, how long do they remain valid? I mean, if we have community views on something, is there a deadline onto them? Might we need to?
I don't know if you
Those
could.
views won't change of what they want now or later.
I don't know if you could put a time on it. It's probably relative to what's changed since you consulted. So the more change that occurs, the less value you can place on that feedback because it doesn't reflect the current environment.
I think there's
If someone is, I mean, if you look at the bigger picture, if someone is wanting a speed limit reduced on this, a certain road, I doubt that would change. The minor details of that might, but we still have an idea what they want, don't we?
It would be to the extent that we need to make further changes that would push for further consultation, I think is probably the bigger driver there. Yes. Depending on the timing that they require it to be.
And if they change something substantially, I am presuming there would be a pot of money to go with that again. If councils are put under that position again, that you need to do this, that won't be an unfunded. There'll be something coming along with that. One would expect, one would hope. One would hope.
There were comments from the minister in his notification to local authorities around not wanting councils to waste money putting things in and then having to change them.
So
I think even if that's not an explicit guarantee or promise, it does give a signal of their intentions around how they would approach that.
With regard to schools, that were fairly safe territory. We've got money in the budget now to do this work, and whereas on the other roads, then that is more likely to be subject to change, given the change of emphasis from road to zero to getting to the destination in a timely way, regardless of safety.
My concern would be in relation to the island, that to not act after going out and consulting the island population would just simply say the bloody council's done it again.
Lose credibility.
Yeah, and it's the credibility aspect of it.
What have we got? We've got schools, Ripiora, there were some areas in Waikaya, wasn't there? That were
Minor extensions like over the ridges in Waikaya.
But other than that, everything else is...
Tautau main centre.
There weren't any big objections in the consultation either, were there?
Sorry?
There weren't any big objections through the consultation piece either. It's not like we're doing this piece of work because Wellington said we had to. Like some of it, like the Waikaya Bridge, has been actually asked for in the community.
Yeah, that was strongly supported.
Yeah.
Was it only like gravel, open roads, potentially going down to 80 that had a bit of don't touch that speed limit comments?
It's definitely, we have to do a lot of reading between the lines, and I think that is where they're getting at, is the wide-scale, network-wide blanket reductions, where speed management plan, where we are at the moment, is quite conservative. We've basically, most of our schools are either variable or not where it sort of makes sense. There's not too many highly contentious.
I think the only part of the speed management plan where there's more of a blanket approach is potentially around our boundary roads.
Okay.
But that presents its own challenges as well in terms of how we approach that.
Is there potential that some of those other schools make sense, those areas that particular communities have asked for, if that makes sense? The wider picture, is there also work to do, not just on speed, but also traffic volumes and getting ideas of what our low volume traffic to higher volume traffic roads are, because that should have a difference in terms of what traffic management plans are needed for activities around those roads. So is that new code coming from NZTA regarding that?
a different sort of legislation being there that's only for temporary situations. But along those same lines, we've already taken that approach. So it's those like the variable speed limits are all on the roads that actually are at primary or secondary collectors, or that makes sense that if we had a permanent speed on there, slowing people down all the time, people would get sick of it and become complacent. And I suppose that's part of why you're getting this feedback from the minister, who are saying we're going to put value in commute times, really consider more variables for those places where they've just gone, no, we'll do blanket.
So what's McCargill doing in terms of Julie's commute on that road that had the boundary? So the McCargill certainly says, and I suspect knowing how that council works, they may go, yep, totally agree, scrap all of this. Do we then put that in a reverse condition when we apply the new rule to the road and create the problem the other way around?
I'd say because of probably the uncertainty around exactly where, and the lack, I suppose, of directive around setting of speed limit, I see it being more just a wait and see approach, see what the new rules say, see what the changes are, what they have to, don't have to do. Other than the boundary roads, probably less effective, as already said, because a lot of the changes are driven by the community. And again, it's indicating that busier roads we are having variable speed limits. So that's also more in line with the indication around consideration of those commute times.
So with the boundary road we were just talking about, it's not like to be a hole after that. We can just keep the old signpost and we've already got the hole. So it's just changing it over, isn't it? I wouldn't have thought that Rocky or Stewart Island would be an issue if we're going ahead in terms of we're talking about getting to a place on time from A to B.
Oh yeah, when you got a tour boat in it, certainly. There was a 5-minute delay to get on a piece of road the other day because I was taking pictures of Christmas lilies.
So they'd have to speed up to go to 30.
Yeah.
As opposed to slow down. So it would seem sensible to proceed, wouldn't it? Yeah.
Yeah, just looking at the travel times, particularly around schools, the stretches of road being reduced, I think they're all below a kilometre in length in terms of the primary and secondary collectors. We're talking seconds of delay when they are operating.
The thing that struck me is that the actuals of what people were driving were reflective of what you were going to put them in anyway.
Yes.
Only perception that it's being slowed down. And on the island, there's only 22 k's of
32. Kilometres.
That like the commute time is hard to justify there too.
And from I suppose a cost point of view, you should bring it up in terms of the boundary roads. You're not going to change the post, there'll be a sign that changes. So grand scheme of things, it's
Just leave them as they are.
They get vandalised anyway, so just replace it. It gets vandalised. Is there anything else you needed to kind of steer on there? Or?
That does cover a lot of it. I think that's really important. There's obviously, when we, and I might just skip forward briefly to schools. I guess this is just to share with you a wee bit of information about the implications around costs for if we had to transition to VSLs for all schools. And I appreciate that if there's a urgency around that, there may be some options for funding on that. But likewise, there would also be an opportunity to look at future funding for that too. So currently we've earmarked, we're anticipating approximately $850,000 to implement the costs as a whole under the speed management plan. Sorry, I don't have that broken down to schools only.
at the moment.
Is that subsidised? Is that our total cost?
That's the total cost, so that would be shared between us and.
So we'd be paying 50%, 55% of that, or 45% of it.
52.48
So
at the moment.
for context, I think we have approximately 1.4 million budgeted. Versus if we chose to implement variable speed limits at all schools, preemptive of where the government may choose to go, that would be looking at closer to 1.3 million. But there would be some timing challenges around implementing the rest of the schools to VSLs before the June funding.
We've identified the most important ones in here though, haven't we?
From a, I suppose, a timing point of view, if we had to look to variables across the board, then we'd, the question earlier about the 30th of June funding, we'd definitely run into problems then. If we had to go to complete variables, just from a supply point of view.
So.
But we wouldn't have the budget either, to be fair.
And that can be discussed at a later time, but if we've already got the funding from Tahi and we've got funding in our budget to do it, then it would seem to make sense to go ahead and use that, particularly as we delay further consultation, increase costs, and it was last triennium we had a discussion and agreed with the principle that the speed around our schools should be dropped. And we can include Rocky in that.
And it comes down to John's point as well, around the credibility thing too, because if we're going back from this now, look, we can blame the government all we want, we're still going to look.
So with the schools with permanent speed limits, there's a wee bit of a breakdown on this slide of, I've grouped them so that we've got 2 locations where we've got both variable and permanent speed limits together. We've got 5 locations which have additional factors that play in a consideration to implement the permanent speed limit. So that's your Stewart Island example where you've got that wider speed zone. Likewise, there's in Te Anau where there's a part of the proposal is a continuation of the permanent 30-kilometre speed limits from the existing slow zone in the centre of town. So it doesn't make sense to install an extra 100 metres of variable beyond that permanent 30k zone. And then we have 9 remaining schools which are simply only permanent speed limits proposed at this point. I don't necessarily intend to go through each and every one of those schools unless there's anything any councillors would like to look at in particular.
Just on that Waikaia one, it's the one submitter sort of pedestrian crossing. Historically, actually the Ulster Community Board has asked for a pedestrian crossing there, even as a community board project. So that there's more than just that submission regarding, I guess, readdressed in the consultation process, but that's also just a consideration that the community are asking for anyway. So,
and that's feedback that came through as part of consultation as well. I'm happy to let you talk to that a bit more around where that fits.
It wouldn't be part of this. There is a bit of a history behind that. It's actually the last week of last year, I got a phone call from Ministry of Education, and they're going to go, I'm waiting for them to get back to us. So they were going to the school to talk about it, and we're going to debate and continue those discussions. But in short, the pedestrian crossing wouldn't be the solution for that area, so talking about other options. Happy to discuss that later if you like.
I've got a Atlassian meeting after this, so if there is any update on where that's at.
Just clarifying the school speed limit reductions, like the one around Otauta School, the abstracts submitters supported lower speed limits. You're saying lower than the 20, lower than the 30 suggested?
No, they supported the lowest speed limits proposed. So that wasn't. They supported the proposed lowered.
Right. Because if I look at community feedback percentage, 11 out of 14. So Does that mean only two supported the lower, the other, I'm not quite sure what the statistics means.
Sorry, yeah, no, I'm happy to explain. So for a Tautau school, in the context of that slide, no.
So what I presumed was that 78.57% was 11 out of 14
Yeah, there we go.
supported.
Yes. So, in terms of comments that we received back, there were two supporters that specifically stated in their comments that they supported the lower speed limit.
Okay, so 11 supported, not just two.
So
These are
yes,
two in addition.
so in the consultation survey, people had the option to determine, say whether they supported it or not, and then likewise add comments. So the 11 out of 14 submitters said they, or clicked the I support button, and 2 people said separately as well that they. It was more just, yeah. So we didn't receive any negative comments on if there's nothing more about schools, we'll just quickly jump through the other roads proposals, because I think they're perhaps the ones which are a wee bit more in question. So we'll start with Takutai o Titi Marae in Colac Bay. So we received a reasonable level of support for that proposal at 60% of submitters, so 6 out of 10. But it is also important to note that we had strong support from the local runaka in relation to this proposal, and we also had strong report from Te Whatu Ora, the National Health Service. The runaka also asked us about whether we would consider extending the 30-kilometre speed limit further along the foreshore road. But the level of support for the wider reductions around Colac Bay would perhaps suggest that's something we would need to go back to the community on if we were wanting to consider it.
That would be my thoughts also, just generally because of the sentiment around that community. If I look at 6 out of 10, it's, just more than half. And that's not such a big community, even if you have to door knock everyone. If I may ask, why did we approach Te Whatu Ora for a comment here, or how come they also submitted?
They submitted under the general submission process.
Have they submitted in all areas, or just there?
They provided a general submission as opposed to completing our survey, but they identified the marae location specifically in their response.
Okay. Right.
So they generally supported the proposed reductions throughout the district, but they called out this location specifically as well.
Lots of children and it's right on, and it's not much of a gap in the front door.
So in the context of timing for this speed management plan, if we were to push ahead with the marae, we wouldn't be able to consult on extending that zone and implement in terms of our timelines. So interested in councillors' thoughts on whether we proceed with as it's been proposed, and then perhaps consider in the future looking at, and based on how the community is adapted to the wider speed limit reduction 50, where that's sitting at a later date, perhaps as part of the next speed management plan review.
There hasn't been any, like in my communication with the Progress League there or anything, any desire from them and their region, the community, to do anything. And I think if we were to try and expand consultation around that road, it's a delicate area.
It is a delicate area.
We're probably setting ourselves up to fail there as well. So, yeah, my suggestion would be to
Is they're not going to be the marae built further down the road in the future too?
in Riverton.
Oh, of course, that's Taramea.
I would be wary on this one, just because of what I've heard and the general sentiment around that area, which is very public for, publicly available.
Can I just ask, in terms of timing, are you bringing this back soon to council for a decision?
that is the intention, yes, if we're going to proceed with the school's proposals.
In order to get this done by the end of June, so it's coming for the next council meeting.
Did we get feedback from schools? There was talk last workshop about going directly to the schools. I think we were talking about like how big of a radius to make the speeds. Is it 100 or 30 metres? And that it was go to the schools and ask them, like they know the lay of the land.
So we approached all schools directly, and when we went to consult, to let them know that we were in fact, we paid, I think, after we adopted, there was discussion around going out to them individually, so we communicated with them directly to provide information specifically on the changes proposed in their area, and then encourage them to vocalise that within their community as well, to get feedback to come back to us. And we did have a good level of response in relation to the schools. And the schools themselves, many of them did provide response in relation to as well. So it didn't necessarily say whether that reflected the wider sentiment of the community as well, or whether that was just the school. But in some cases, it was the Board of Trustees speaking as the school community as a collective. So it wasn't just individuals in their individual capacity. I know Tautau Main Street, while there was support for the changes around the school, the proposal to lower the speed limits further down Main Street between the bridge and Chester Street had more of a mixed level of positive response from the community.
I have probably had similar ones in my community board, and I think the community board is also equally split between half of them wanting what we call the traffic calming this thing to be removed because they narrow the road there substantially. There have been people whose car doors open and there's just no gap. Plus where it is narrowing is that agricultural machinery shop and also the vehicles that are parked there. So, and it is reflective here in this percentage as well. So I don't know if we have some statistics there because I find it hard to judge or even to make my own decision how I feel. Do we have statistics of have there been accidents or roads and all of that? Because half of the board is saying it is dangerous, so that narrowing the road so much there, and when you know it is bigger, unless you had a bypass or something there that bigger trucks or vehicles, you have to take the bypass. They said other than that, we are setting ourselves up for failure. And I would rather if we have some data there to inform.
We can definitely have a look. We utilise the National Crash Data Register. So
if we had something there, I would
have a look at
over my next board meeting and
look at how many crashes have been.
Definitely, though, was submissions saying also like some saying, "Hey, it's narrow," which is what they were installed for traffic calming.
In the first place.
Yeah,
I know.
And there were definitely submissions too saying, "Please do not touch."
Yeah, and that's why I'm confused because I've heard the same sentiment there. It's pretty much an equal split.
Yep.
Yeah.
And I don't know which way. And my own decision, I can only make it if there is some definitive accidents. Everyone keeps saying near misses. I haven't seen one of those. So it's hearsay for me so far.
The difficulty, sorry.
I was just going to say the variable speed limit is always difficult over a short piece of road for the motorist. You're going from 50 to 30 to 40, 50 to 40 to 50. So we actually want the motorists watching the road, not the signs too.
Yeah. And submitters did express that very point.
It's quite a good one.
So, and I guess over the page is the comments that we received back, and I'm not expecting everyone to read that right now, but it does.
The other option there would be to stop it, reduce it right before the DT King's Yard. So the moment one is turning out from Tuatapri, you're heading down that road just past the yard because those signs are in very quick succession and the school comes right before you know it. So either we make it one sign and it starts a bit sooner, which is currently in the 100K, but you move that a bit. People have the time to slow down because otherwise I don't think it's going to have much impact. Just my personal thoughts though. I'm not speaking for my board here. That's what I feel. It'll be just too much.
Well, it's been a fast street.
I'll be probably the one slamming all this one.
So notwithstanding a need for seeing some statistics around accidents or injuries that have occurred in that location, is there any kind of feel from councillors around how they think we should be considering the proposal in Otau?
Brett's kind of hit the nail on the head with what was needed to make a decision, and yeah, interesting. Well, it's good that the board's reflecting the feedback in the community too.
Yeah, the board split there, yeah.
But I think we don't want to be going out and putting in something that then gets brought back to us later on with what's been raised about going from 30 to 50 to 40. If we were to implement something like that, we're sort of subjecting ourselves to.
So the 50 would need to be moved back so that by the time you come to the school, you have one step.
That's to the north, from the north heading in south.
Yeah.
It is quite a, call it that rural zone, it's a reasonable. And so one of the disadvantages on that northern end is you don't really have any got a gap where there's no development.
Yep.
And so the look and feel for people to slow down is very open. Yeah. So there's some other challenges with not just the speed limit itself, but getting people to
slow down there.
Why do we have to slow down when there's no development on either side of the road for probably a good 400 or 500 metres maybe?
Yeah.
Well, look into a bit more detail on that.
Sorry, just from my understanding, was that the north coming from the north?
Yes. Or the other thing which has been said is there a possibility of a bypass for bigger vehicles? And again, I don't know how practical or feasible and how resource hungry that sort of this thing is.
Put a new bridge in.
I mean, you get them all to move from behind the railway line or that side.
Yeah, and then go back in again.
Yes.
Yeah, it's a bit tricky.
So that's an empty one, pretty much, unless people are heading to the back road to the pub. It is empty.
The challenge is there is just probably a bit more around the practical aspect, around the curve, turning up and down those streets with longer vehicles.
Yeah.
So it's probably a bit more of a longer term strategy.
The thing with Rakiura is I guess the community's kind of plan, this is what we want, and this is how we want the town to function, and this is how the speed limits. It kind of almost comes with spatial and functional planning exercise rather than just we need to address speed. And so for maybe Otau, it's the same thing where it's let's deal with the school, but
for Rakiura, it's different. Yeah.
The community have that same kind of conversation of how do you want this town to function, and where's future growth going to be? Is a bypass something that works? I think of Lumsden in the same way, but the hard part of Lumsden is the main street is Wakakatahi, so the one area where it's this is where kids cross to go from the shop for an ice block and back, go to the brand new playground that's getting built for them. Can we get a slower speed or a pedestrian crossing? It's a highway, so.
Underpass.
Yeah, moving like cattle stop.
You did right though. Otau being a good example, I suppose. Got a bit more control there because we are the RCA. So it comes down to the town planning and what you want the look and feel of the town centre to be and how that matches with the speed environment, and then where do things like your heavy vehicles actually go.
I'd say more of sort of like a spatial and functioning plan.
Yeah, and something even on the other end of town, you have as you're coming up the road. Say 55 and you're going to hit a 50 zone right there. And the sign that you're seeing is, if you're a tourist, it's misleading slightly. So either that also gets moved, but no clear answers there.
So we could, with the town centre in Otau, look to come back at a later date, having looked at that place in terms of speed limit and speed calming infrastructure working together to explore what options are viable. But that would mean we aren't making any changes now, but it seems that there's a certain degree of perhaps hesitancy with making that reduction at the moment. So perhaps that's a more measured approach to look at that in the future, in the near future.
That fits into Christine and I were responding to each other because we were having a discussion at the board chairs meeting last night around town planning and spatial planning and everything, and that fits that really well, and it actually forms a part of what the community will plan to morph into. It will speak to a lot of the stuff that we're doing, so it'll inform all these consultation documents because you're getting that accurate reflection of what the community wants at the start of the process. So,
And the consultation's already there, in
yeah,
effect.
it's already done, yeah.
It'll probably also give us, by then we should have some direction of where speed management plan or government direction is around speed, so it gives us a bit more clarity of that as well.
Yep. Okay. So boundary roads, I know we've already touched on this briefly, but we'll just provide a proper background of the situation with the boundary roads. So there's 4 boundary roads that we consulted on that ICC have asked us to consider reducing to align with their speeds. ICC consulted on theirs, showing changes on their sides of the road. So for clarity, the road is split in half down the middle, and one half is ICC and one half is SDC. And they have already implemented the changes on those sections of roads following adopting those changes in 2022. So that is both sides of the road that signage is on currently at the ICC speeds. So, and that's I guess the confusion that's coming up for people now, because what's on the road doesn't align to what's in the National Speed Limits Register.
Something else just to add to that, these are shared roads too that ICC manage on behalf.
Mm-hmm.
So the other one, they manage the day-to-day. We have agreements in place where we look after some of the boundary roads and they look after others. These are the ones that pay after on a day-to-day. So essentially, that's how they've implemented speeds on these particular ones.
It's changing the register. There's no actual physical work to do anything.
No, it's a
Lack of a better word, probably an administrative function.
Mm-hmm.
We said that they didn't actually focus particularly on the users of those roads. Consulting on it.
Like, it's a bit of an overkill, I think, on Kennington, 1 road and the other one from 1 south.
Not really.
Yeah, yeah.
It's a long stretch of road.
Yeah, straight. Yeah.
You could probably use another word to describe that rather than overkill, probably, Paul.
All right, yeah. Well, I suppose that's true. Yeah. Sorry.
What do they go with the, so it's Apuri, Morawai?
Sorry, no, I've skipped past them. We'll come back to them. We won't miss them. So,
Okay, well, it just wasn't in this.
oh, okay.
I've gone back to the,
I don't know why they've come out, but they should be there.
they are in there.
Yeah. I'll provide a revised. Actually, no, they didn't need to be in there. Sorry, I'll clarify on those ones. Those ones had good community support to implement those changes. There was really nothing in the way of commentary against those proposals. So didn't feel that they were something that we had to specifically cover today, unless there was something more that councillors wanted to discuss on those ones.
But they're still in the plan, even though it's...
Yes, absolutely, yes. Yes, sorry, and likewise for the schools with variable speed limits, we don't cover them in the presentation at all. They were widely supported within the community, so unless there was specific someone wanted to talk about, we won't cover them today, but they are still part of that decision. Yeah. So there are some challenges if we chose not to implement the boundary roads changes, and those challenges mainly relate to how we would approach that with IT. And I think probably in a practical sense that would be quite difficult to achieve a backpedal from ICC on the changes they've already implemented. So we may be stuck with the only remaining option to have leave the roads as they are in the state of confusion with the register between the signage, or implementing 2 separate speed limits for either side of the road, which does seem a bit silly. I wouldn't say it's a practical solution, but that's, yeah.
Drivers won't know about it.
And I think it would just add confusion.
Yeah, we'd like to.
You wouldn't have to pass someone, you'd have to slow down to 80.
You just drive down the fast side.
Yes, yeah.
Even if it's the wrong side of the road, you just...
Yes. Could create some risk. So what is councillor's sentiment in relation to the boundary roads?
I know what my sentiment is, but I know what the reality probably is.
Yeah, exactly.
That sums it up,
Okay. The 70 km/h speed limit adjustments that were proposed, we were required to review these under the speed management plan as a requirement of the rule. The changes announced by government do not change the requirement to review these when implementing a speed management plan. So if we implement a speed management plan, these still have to be present. There were two sides to this. There are 8 roads or 8 areas proposed, 4 areas where changes were proposed to the existing 70 km speed limits, and 4 areas where they were set to be retained. I have not covered those that are being retained because there was insufficient opposition to changing them to another speed limit. So all we have is the 4 that we've proposed to change, and you'll see there, based on the level of support, that it's pretty mixed. But I just wanted to cover with you today that we don't have very many options in relation to these changes because it relates to a safe road environment under Waka Kotahi's requirements. And in order to, I guess, retain those speed limits, we'd essentially have to look at additional safety infrastructure on those roads to retain them.
To retain them at the current 70, you mean?
That's correct, yeah. So, and even if we did make a decision to investigate and install that infrastructure, it's likely, and I'll let my roading colleagues here confirm this, that we'd probably need to reduce the speed limits in the interim until that infrastructure is in place under the speed management plan.
They're sealed roads. I don't know where these ones
I think Mere Road's not sealed, is it?
Mere Roads, yeah.
It's struggle to be doing 60 k's on it.
Yeah.
Which is interesting when you look at the support as opposed to a reduction. It's
I'd be interested to know how many of them that were opposed it actually drive it regularly.
Yeah.
The remaining roads are all sealed roads.
So in Edendale, that was just who responded. It was householders along the road.
Yeah, so we did have one specific responder talk about, as a householder in Edendale, that there were some challenges with the faster speeds that are currently in place on those roads.
I think as well, when you've only got 11 responses,
It's not
a significant difference in the...
not a high level of response relative to other parts of the consultation.
A whole lot more people that live on it.
Yeah. So, do councillors have any views on? I don't know that we have a lot of option, do we, in terms of implementing these? I think it was more just clarifying the challenge between the feeling and the submissions that we got relative to the actions that would be required.
Well, I think the key one that you've mentioned there is the cost of not doing it, coming into long-term plan and setting rates, and we don't want to be throwing additional expenses in.
Yeah. Okay. I think the fact is in those, Edendale at both the Wyndham end and the Seaward Downs end near where I live, there's no policing of speed anyway. It's not a
Really,
variety
just
in
proposing to
the
put up
speeds.
the signs to tell people to slow down, which would help compliance in a big way, I think. What it reminds people, but it's a long main street, well, Seaward Road coming in there. People forget, keep going faster.
Yeah, and both, I suppose that's sometimes a challenge, which we spoke about at Tadau, good example. When there isn't any development and there's a long leading, people do forget.
It doesn't feel like you should go slower, so therefore you should be going slower, you're going faster again.
I suppose in that, if you think of a section to Wyndham at least, there's been a few houses that have cropped up over the recent years too, a bit more development.
And I will just jump back very quickly to Stewart Island. So now we've talked about that a wee bit already, and conscious that Stewart Island actually was consulted on two parts of our consultation, one in relation to the school and the other being a more wider general area. Naturally, that of course gives us different types of responses based on our surveys, and they are a little bit different from each other, but still both in favour of the changes. I just wanted to note, because I know it was raised by councillors before we went out for consultation around the size of the zone, we didn't receive any commentary back in relation to changing that 30k zone. So either expanding it or reducing it. In fact, we didn't have any specific comments at all. We only had ticks of support or opposed for it. So it's more just to inform councillors, unless they had any further thoughts on that. It's probably something under the wider SMP that we wait to hear back further if that is wanting to be extended.
I'm going to be a bad chair here, and I'm just going to deviate slightly based on the discussion with the board chair last night. I promised I'd ask you because you're here today. The parking bylaw on Stewart Island, where's that currently at?
So that review has been parked for the time being because this piece of work had to take priority. Once this work has been put in, then that will be picked up again and continued on with. And the
away you go and get this underway now.
So next capital, correct?
Basically, yes, that's correct. This one has had to take precedence because of the timelines to implement. Yeah.
The previous timelines.
The previous
we understand that, though. That's all right.
Yeah. So it's not gone from memory or out of our commitment.
Cool. I'll bring us back onto. Tom's got his hand up.
I'll report back to him this afternoon.
Yeah. Rob. Sorry, Tom, I don't know how long you've had it up. Matt's just pointed it out. Apologies if you've been waiting a while.
No, you're all good. You're all good. Hey, just with regards to speed in general in towns and villages and stuff, and trying to figure out, what the right speed should be or shouldn't be, regardless of consultation. I mean, once Waka Kotahi passes a law stating what the speed needs to be, have we had a discussion around how we can digitise that? So, maybe actually just downloading the app on your phone, and when you actually enter that speed zone, it actually physically, it actually tells you what speed you should be doing and at what time. And so then it's easy to actually update that software. It's cost effective. And then there's actually no need to physically change any signs. Is there any sort of discussion around doing that sort of thing?
So one of the big changes that came out also during when they went from the old bylaw system to these speed management plans was the requirement that we feed into the National Speed Limit Register. So that is now New Zealand's central point of understanding. But then I suppose that then allows third-party apps to use that to feed into whatever, so like your Garmin's and things like that would be directly talking to that. Where once upon a time they would have had to have gone to each council and gone and updated it. So I suppose the answer is they've done it. They've gone halfway. They've got all the information in one spot, but you need to go to a third party to get it. Like showing it in your car.
So what's the reality? I mean, so does that for there mean that it just sort of stops, or is there a possibility that a third party could be engaged and then something like that could be implemented? If you think of it from a nationwide perspective in terms of the the practicality and the cost saving associated with that, even if it was with separate councils and you engaged a third party to be able to, take on board that possibility? Do you think that's a conversation that could continue, or would it just stop?
I think that already exists. I think the idea being that NZTA made the central point, so all the newer cars that have inbuilt GPSs and things like that are already talking to this system.
I do note that in Garston, as you go through, the sign says 80 kilometres. If you've got a car that has it's 60.
Yeah.
There's a few places
I
like
think
that.
it's a special place
Places
for
like
Garston. Yeah.
But I don't think you're meant to be on your phone when you're driving.
Exactly.
I mean, if you we have e-roads on our dashboard, on our car, and if you go in and you're going over the limit, it beeps at you and it sends an email to...
It's definitely got its limitations as well.
Sends an email to you.
Like for the technology.
E-roads is a have.
Absolute have. To Tom's point, though, that does put the importance on making sure that any update that is done after consultation goes straight into that registry.
Correct.
If someone's caught speeding, no, my card told me this was the 70 zone, no, it's 50, and if council hasn't updated the registry, then they're talking their way out of a ticket. Then does that make councils liable for that fault at that point?
No, because we can't, there's no reliability. We've got a responsibility to update the register. It's not an enforceable speed limit until it is, but then we can't also then rely on how good the GPS is that they're using and things like that.
It highlights the issue with boundary roads and the inconsistencies between what's signposted and what's in the National Register. There's the exact sort of challenges occurring.
Is the National Register available as like a GIS? Like, can you go on
It's ISRI-based
space council road?
Yep. Go through the maps and look
overnight, really.
All that you have to do is just Google National Speed Limit Register. It'll come up, and you can type in a particular road or zoom in on a road or.
When you can't sleep at night.
But yeah, the way the law's written is that as soon as it's in the register, that's then becomes law, and that's the speed limit. For other third parties, you mentioned E-roads, we have the same problem. Something changes, you get an email, but then we've had to look into it a few times, and then E-roads is out of date, so you have to just let them know.
I claim that quite often.
To the point it would replace signage on roads, I think it's similar to digital currency replacing paper currency, because you're always going to have somebody who doesn't have access to that technology. So yes, it's probably an enhancer, but I feel there's a lot of work probably on the regulatory side as well to push something like that through.
Well, I guess what you could say is, once again, you could incentivise that by saying that, we had a report this morning from Space Ops talking about the accuracy, the pinpoint accuracy of GPS technology. Isn't that an incentive for, say, insurance companies to say, if you install the software into your car, then the technology and the software that we have available right here in Southland can actually, can give you that information, and there's kind of like a no excuses policy associated with that when you're relying on the organisation to do the updates because they're getting paid to do it anyway.
There's also the requirement, though, that you drive at a speed that's safe for the road conditions and environment that you're in. So when that's regardless of what the speed limit says.
So when you've got the kind of technology that the guys were talking about this morning, I mean, that's, when you're starting to talk about within centimetres of accuracy, they're talking about real-time technology. So it's updated pretty much every 10 seconds. So once you actually adopt that technology and you can use it, and you can incentivise, like I say, a person to say, well, if I'm a responsible person on the road, then my insurance company will recognise that, and so will, Waka Kotahi, and so will safety. I mean, everybody you know, it is ultimately still the responsibility of the user of the vehicle or the road. But that incentivisation, I think, is potentially a good opportunity in association with some of the technology and data that could be available in the next few years, right?
I think, Tom, actually, it might already exist. I remember seeing ads about it was for young drivers on their restricted for an insurance company that would monitor their driving, and if they were, the better they drove, the cheaper it got.
Absolutely.
Technology.
Yeah, absolutely. It's I guess, look, it might be idealistic, but it's that kind of, it's showing that seed and having that level of mentality that I think, you know, sort of overarches everything, regardless of whether the government or whether local councils implement, you know, certain rules and regulations around traffic management and speed, you know. It's just that, I guess it's just that overall understanding of the philosophy, and that insurance type model that you've just spoken of, you know, it's a proven one. So anyway.
I wonder if it'll ever come that it could actually disable the car that's doing the wanton destruction of our signs. It's funny.
Technology will be eventually that would. If every car tells you what speed it is, and you need to spend $11 million replacing signs.
No, exactly.
You won't even have to drive your car.
Ideally.
Okay, where are we?
Yeah, you guys got enough?
Yeah, we've gone through everything we wanted to go through today. So thank you very much for your listening ear and your input.
Everyone looks forward to the next one.
Can I raise one little thing? So currently, actually, Hartley, you'll remember we early on the piano flat road signage of 20-kilometre signs
At the dock end.
at that end got replaced, which is good. But I don't think the National Speed Register has actually ever been it's technically still 100k with 20k signs. So I don't know what the actual reality of that is. It's obviously meant to be, the community wants it to be a 20k sign, but I think it may have been.
It goes with the cross on the side of the road, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Might have been another government organisation that put them up.
Or just some locals with some access to stuff.
I don't think it's a. Yeah, I have to have a look.
So how would you go about at this point updating a national speed register for something that's been for the last 40 years a 20k zone?
I suppose there's a big difference between updating the register for something that never got consulted on versus just updating it because it's there. We would still need to consult on it.
Retrospective consultation.
I'll double check our old speed limit bylaw. I think it might have, maybe not changed. I'll double check.
Yeah.
And it gets squatters' rights because it's been there for so long.
Yeah.
I understand they were originally 20 miles an hour. That's how long the 20 signs have been there. It was back when it was miles anyway.
Well, they've just covered up the
They've been replaced. But
yeah.
it's technically still 100.
If a change was required to be implemented to reflect that, that can be done outside of the speed management plan process. If it needed to be done with urgency.
If it was proven that it had been consulted on.
Yes.
Yeah.
I'll have a look.
I'm sure there's some signs. Same 20.
But there are opportunities to make a change outside of the speed management plan process. Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Very good. And that, unless there's anyone else waiting in the line.
So we have an impromptu workshop on something else. Not an impromptu.
Reveal geomorphology.
Thank you very much, everybody.
We ended up school teacher. We had to write a policy on why we had policies.
Thousands and thousands.
Yep, come did.
Citizens' advice.